So we've had a little bit about chatbots and voice interfaces, of course, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunities for writers. And I'm going to cover a mixture of chat and voice interfaces. They're slightly different. So this is the typing kind of bots, but also voice interfaces like Amazon products, just in case someone has one in the room. I don't want to mention the trigger word. Google products, Apple products, which generally don't work so well, and a few others. But some of the principles are different and some of them are similar. So we'll cover mostly the similarities with some of the differences. And why is this an interesting time, I suppose, and why does it appeal to me, and why I think it should appeal to other word people, is because up until now, most interfaces have kind of made us interact with them in a somewhat counterintuitive way. We've had to sort of learn their paradigms and adapt the way that we use them to that. Whereas conversational interfaces are conversations. We're actually used to conversation, although maybe slightly less than we used to be. So actually they let us interact with applications and systems in a more natural way. Well, that's the point anyway. And that's kind of why I find it interesting. But also, more interestingly, hopefully for everybody here, so over the past year or so, and you're probably the same, and other speakers have said the same, we've attended lots of events where we've heard about conversational interfaces. We've heard, and I've heard over and over again, how so many of these interfaces need good writers. A lot of them are written by the developers, and that's not a problem per se, but to make these conversational interfaces useful, sometimes you need good writing. And pretty much every company I have met in the past few months has said, we need good writers. So it's actually a good opportunity for new work for us as well. So in this presentation, I'm going to outline some of the best practices for writing for conversational interfaces. A lot of this has been inspired by other people, especially an Alexa, oops, I said the word, okay, anyway, an Alexa DevRel person, advocate person called Andrea Mattoni. So I want to especially name check him because a lot of the inspiration comes from him, with some other ideas thrown in. And I've been working on a few ideas for this myself, and some of that will come up. First up, warning. This is going to be an interactive presentation. It's about conversation, so we need to have a conversation. So I'm going to ask some very probably stupid questions, and we'll see what sort of answers we get from you. Okay, I think these numbers are even slightly out of date now, but this is the rise of messaging apps. And we hear various things in the media constantly about whether they're becoming more or less popular. But messaging platforms generally are now exceptionally popular. This is the big four, which includes WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, WeChat, and Viber, depending kind of where you are in the world. And there's others as well, used internally with companies. We have someone from Slack later. I coincidentally am wearing my Cisco Spark socks today. So there's lots of internal messaging applications too. And pretty much all of them have some kind of framework for chatbots. So these numbers will rise, and what we can do with those tools will rise as well. It's a similar story for voice interfaces. Again, this is a little out of date. It's important to note that voice interfaces especially are not new. They did not begin in 2014. If you remember phone systems that you have been speaking to for decades. So actually, some of these paradigms have existed for quite a while, but it's rapidly growing. And with the markets expanding, I know they're not particularly widely spread outside the English-speaking world at the moment, but it is changing. So they're becoming more and more used by people. So this is my own little experiment. DocsBot is a hypothetical chatbot or voice interface that I've been prototyping for some time. That is sort of an idea for interacting with documentation. Whether that's a good idea or not is not really the point. It's just something I wanted to use as an experiment to try some principles. And we'll have a little look at it later. So, what's the first piece of advice? Designing for people. Putting your user first is, of course, not a new statement in the tech space at all, but it's actually far more important with conversational interfaces. And again, not a new concept, but before progressing any further, you should prototype your ideas, plan them out. Now, the great aspect of conversational interfaces is that this literally involves having conversations with people. Here's an interesting photo from the BBC, Research and Development Department. This woman is playing Alexa. Oh, I said it again. Sorry. I don't think I'll stop worrying about it. She's playing Alexa, and these people over here are playing the user. And they're literally having practice conversations with each other. And the screen is important because humans obviously get a lot from the face, and there is no face with these interfaces. So you have to remove that from the equation as well. So listen to these conversations as you set out these basic tasks that you want to accomplish and sort of observe what people say. This will help you understand if your use case even makes sense as a voice interface, and there are a lot that don't, actually. These sorts of interfaces aim to replace traditional UIs with something more simple, like asking questions. And in a lot of cases over the years with web and mobile applications and smartphone applications, we've actually been sort of overcomplicating interfaces that were actually simpler before. So a classic example is like flight booking. You know, when you book a flight now, you do a lot of searching, you kind of click through a lot of pages, you look for times, etc., etc. Whereas actually with a chatbot, you could say, I want to go from Kraków to Berlin tomorrow. And it actually is a far simpler process in some respects. That's actually a very good example of how it then simplifies a process we actually have overcomplicated in the past. So, exercise number 1. And we'll have to shout a bit. I've also lost my hearing in one ear, so you'll have to shout even louder. I come from mostly working in the software world, so I'm going to use as an example a piece of software that some of you might know called Docker. Let's not worry too much about what Docker is right now. If some of you do know, then that's great. So how would this conversation work? Imagine I'm a new developer and I want to know how to install Docker. What would be some keywords that might be useful? Anyone have any ideas? I cannot hear a word anyone is saying, but I was
saying Docker, install, quick start.
Yep.
How to start.
Yep.
Windows, Mac, Linux.
Yep, exactly. And this is actually the interesting thing with conversation interfaces especially, and I know we've all encountered this a lot in searching as well with structure of our documentation. People use different words to mean the same thing. And this is especially true when it comes to conversational interfaces. We heard quick start, we heard install, we heard Windows, we heard platforms. So it could be things like, hey DocSpot, I'm running a Mac, I want to install Docker. The other interesting thing here is that often, and we're going to come into this in a bit more detail later, that because it's running on a machine, it actually knows what you're using. So you could extrapolate that it's going to be running on a Mac or something like that as well. So you actually have some extra kind of smarts here. So you have to have a little bit of variety in the phrases you listen for example. And what the DocSpot then tells you is possibly a bigger discussion, but this is an exercise. This is purely an example right now. The next interesting one is writing for ears and eyes when it comes to more text-based chatbots. Conversation is still conversation even when we read it. Now, the interesting aspect here for us as technical writers is that this actually often involves unlearning a lot of what we know already. We have sort of perfected our skills over the years to produce the best written words to explain ideas. But we all know and acknowledge that the spoken word is not always the best form of sentences. We tend to cut corners, we tend to use slang, we tend to use different ways of saying things than when we write them. So you have to acknowledge that words you use in conversational interfaces may not be the best or the cleverest way of saying something, but they are the most ideal for the medium. And there's also a lot of differences between the ears and the eyes, and this is possibly more relevant to voice interfaces. And this is actually a very interesting thing that I'd never really thought about before. Eyes, I've got a little graphic here, there we go, very nice. Eyes expect uniformity. We want something that is familiar, we want structures that are familiar, we look out for things often these days as we just rapidly scroll through, and we kind of want to see things we're used to seeing. But ears like variety. Imagine a conversation that sounds the same every time. That's awkward, frustrating, and pretty boring, actually. So think of those times when you interacted with some of those earlier conversational interfaces like phone systems, or imagine having a conversation with a person who just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. I imagine you would get frustrated with that very, very quickly. So in your conversational interfaces, you have to think about in the same way. You need to have some variety and different ways of saying and identifying the same meaning. So finding the perfect sentence is no longer enough. We actually need to find the perfect half dozen sentences. And these differences will help the user and the conversation. So let's have another exercise here. So let's try a conversation where we introduce variety to a potentially frustrating conversation. So what, in English, of course, or if you want to shout things out in Polish, then go for it. I won't know what you're saying, but that's fine. What are different ways we could say, I don't understand?
What did you mean?
Wow. Okay, great. I've done this talk to other audiences, and I think we got like 2 answers. So I only heard a few of them, but I heard people saying things, so that's good. So, you have to start to think this way. Firstly, how can you make the conversational interface reply in a varied way? But also, how do you understand the person saying in a variety of different ways they don't understand? And some of this comes into the technical implementation as well. And this is actually possibly one of the more frustrating aspects some of you might have had when you've used conversational interfaces. There's kind of 2 ways you can make them. One is basically just huge text trees, and they don't really learn. And if you go down a path that doesn't exist, it just kind of leads you nowhere. And then there's the other more advanced ones where they use things like natural language processing, which we saw some cover of earlier, that are harder to build, but can evolve more over time and sort of become more complex with the way they understand things. The next one is making assumptions clear. And I have a nice picture here, if you can read it. How to summon a, not quite sure what the word is. And this comes back to when we saw the picture earlier with the removing facial expressions. Because as humans, we actually make hundreds of assumptions a day based on the information we receive. And these can be context or culturally based and not always clear to someone else. And this is why I think like smiley faces and things like that have become, smiley faces, emojis, that's the right word, have become useful because even though, again, they're open to misinterpretation, they sort of help nuance a conversation. Although I discovered recently, there's a fascinating article, I can't remember, I think it was in the Guardian, I think, about how millennials use emojis in different ways from other people. And I realized I'd been using emojis in one way, and if I've been speaking to someone else, they might have been misinterpreting it completely. So there's some interesting things here. So when designing a conversational interface, we have to be as clear as possible as to when a user is expected to make a further interaction. So don't hide the interactions in assumptions, but directly ask questions and most crucially, keep the conversations that the machine is making brief. You don't write essays in your answers. They have to be brief and to the point and lead people to the next interactions you need. So, okay, let's try another quick exercise where we will present a series of steps after getting started. So how do we let the user know that they can select this option without being annoying, bearing in mind what we've covered so far? And this is probably one of the more challenging ones. So for example, okay, so here is where I'll give you a little bit more background on what Docker is, because it's helpful to know. So it's actually a developer tool that lets you run applications in a very sort of isolated way. And you can run up very quick sort of isolated environments for WordPress, for PHP, for all sorts of tools and things like that, and then get rid of them again fairly quickly. So once you've installed it, what would be something you want to do next? You've got the software installed on a computer. What do you want to do next? I can't hear anything anybody's saying. So, so this is a problem in itself, maybe, with voice interfaces. But yes, I guess some of the suggestions will be things like show me how to get started on operating system of choice. Show me how to start with a particular application. Things like that. And this is actually where the design aspects become more interesting. Is how do you design the equivalent of a menu without overwhelming people? And you have to think somewhat clearly about the most obvious next steps, but also give people an opportunity to jump ahead, I suppose. And I did say that the DocSpot is not necessarily a good example of a voice interface. It's just one we're going with. Maybe throughout this presentation, anyone who was thinking of making a bot for documentation realizes it's actually a terrible idea. And that's fine. That's good. That's not a bad thing. Okay, next tip is to use information wisely. And I've mentioned this a little bit, but again, imagine if you had a conversation with a human, and I know people who've had conversations with me know I do this myself, but they forget information that you've already told them. It's quite frustrating. I've just told you something about myself, 2 minutes later, you ask me the same question again. Maybe you give them an excuse, you let them off that time. If they ask you again, kind of like, I don't think this person's really listening to me. So, This applies more to conversational interfaces, but it's actually quite interesting. Because these are running on computers, computers are actually very good at remembering things that we tell them. So we can use this information quite wisely throughout the conversation. For example, with the DocSpot example, if they've already told us they're using a Mac, we could probably ignore telling them anything about Windows or Linux for the foreseeable future. If we know they've already installed and started their first kind of Docker instance, then we probably don't need to tell them how to do that again in this conversation. The differences come a little bit depending on the use case, whether you remember things just for that conversation or whether you remember things in every conversation. And this also gets into privacy issues and a whole bunch of other issues. And we are on GDPR, happy GDPR day, so this is going to become even more interesting. But it's an interesting way of changing and shaping the conversation as we go. So use that information wisely, but again, depending on what information is, then make sure you get consent to use that information more than ever. So I do have a little example of my DocSpot here. I think it's a video, but I can't actually remember how well it runs. Obviously not very well at all by the looks of it, so it's fine. Oh, there we go. But you saw the rough idea there. Basically what I just said was that the user tells us something, so now we know some information, we could skip some steps ahead, and on it goes. And this is especially useful for things like location, user preferences, stuff like that. I think I may jump through exercise 4, firstly because I'm struggling to hear you, but secondly because time is running out. But actually, one example I wanted to throw in here that feeds back to the video I just showed is also knowing the subtleties of information. For example, I've got an example here of Ubuntu Linux that has version numbers that are dates, like 1604, for example, and understanding what that means. Again, the translation talk had some nice aspects of domain knowledge, and the technology is obviously a space that has a lot of domain knowledge. So understanding what those nuances of words mean as well. Keep it short. This isn't a new statement in the world of online writing. We've kind of learnt to do this quite well over the past few years. We are used to people having short attention spans now, and we are tailoring our writing to be as efficient as possible at getting a point across. But this actually applies even more with conversational interfaces. We actually have very short attention spans with our ears. And there's a lot of evidence to show that lectures are kind of the worst way of giving people information because people are not paying that much attention. So you have to keep information quite short and as long as necessary without being rude. Sometimes someone giving you very short answers can also be kind of rude as well. I think this is one of my favorite pictures as well. That is I don't know. I'm not actually sure why it's relevant to this presentation, but I like it. It's kind of an example of we all know stories. If you've ever seen The Simpsons, of Grandpa Simpson talking for a very long time, and people just get bored and switch off and lose interest at some point. So it played. Look at that. There we go. so thinking about this, using our DocSpot continually as an example, we've already sort of learnt along this path that is it a good idea? I'm not sure. But if we actually wanted to give the person some information, is an Alexa reading out 500 words about how to get started with software? Is that going to work? Probably not. How could we use it in different ways? There's not really any wrong or right answers here, actually. This is sort of more something to think about. How do you get long-form content into short-form content? And often, as you probably know from your own interactions with these devices, it's actually more of a prompt to do other things. So, for example, I think some of the best examples I've seen of people using something like a DocSpot is in things like Slack, where you ask it and GitHub do this a lot. They actually have ways where you can ask a very quick question in a conversational way, but it provides you a direct link instead. So this is actually possibly where these sorts of tools are more useful to us as technical writers in our documentation in helping people find things we want them to find, but actually reading out an entire manual to someone is probably not that useful to them. So the main reason I kind of wanted to give this talk to you is that conversational interfaces are still in their early days. Even some of the considered sort of veteran platforms are still early. They're actually, for example, Amazon is actually still paying developers to build skills because they want them. So it's still new. It's a new world, and there are no experts yet. Sorry, I've got funny ears, obviously. There is no expert yet in people using them or creating them. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the commercial tools are all cloud-based. Google and Alexa are both using cloud infrastructures. So the nice thing here is it's very quick and easy to get feedback and react to that feedback. If you find that a high percentage of your users are using particular phrases to trigger an interaction that you haven't got in the interface, it's very quick to find that information out and add it in, and they instantly get an update. So it's very easy to iterate. A lot of the platforms don't give any kind of very good debugging, but you'll just sort of get long lists of errors basically, and you'll have to work your way through them. But there are some now third-party tools trying to make that better. But as we've seen through the presentation, words are exceptionally important in this space. And this is a room mostly full of writers, of people who work with words on a daily basis. So I would strongly encourage you to get involved in the space, especially when it comes to the design aspect, because no one is an expert, so you can become one quite easily and teach other people how to use words more wisely in these sorts of interfaces. So that's been me. Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk some more afterwards, and if you like my little chinchilla over here, I have a few stickers. I have been traveling for quite a bit, and I'm running out rapidly, but you can always ask me, and I can send you one anyway as well. But thank you very much anyway.
Thank you, Chris. Guys, questions? Okay, we have at least 2 questions.
Okay, I saw that arm first. I'm not sure.
Hey Chris, I'm Pavel, maybe you remember me. So I'm sorry, but I don't have a question, but I just have like an idea, because you were talking about the Docsbot, and you're saying about long form content, and I thought it could, like, the Docsbot could give you a TED talk or whatever, or a lecture on something. Like, you could say, how do I how do I use Docker, and what is it useful for? And the bot would say, okay, let me tell you about Docker, and you can decide if it's useful for you. And then it goes into this whole diatribe. But then I came up with a brilliant idea, which I'm gonna copyright right now. It's called a video bot.
Very quick. There's a lot of other people here.
So it's called a video bot.
Yeah.
You guys, so instead of giving you a talk, it could give you a video, right? So those could be videos you pre-record in forms of tutorials or whatever, like a talk about this is what Docker is, this is how you use it, or you could even like write them up and it like add some media that it would animate and just show you, like, so we could say, can I show you a video, and then it just pops up, right?
It's actually an aspect I didn't really touch on, but when it comes to the actual implementation, all these platforms also are hooked into other technical tools. You don't have to do everything with text. They often give you ways of triggering other services and opening web pages and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a conversation that can trigger other actions very easily, especially if it's web page based. So the HTML or the modern web is a complicated beast. You could do all sorts of things with it. So there was another one you said. I didn't see the arm.
Yes,
so.
there was one right here.
Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Gabriela. Thank you for your presentation. It was cool. I love how you put attention to language, and that was really great. But actually, I would like to know some recommendation from you. So I'm working for a global company, like huge one. Mostly, I'm focusing during my daily work on digital workplace tools and end user communication, tutorials, e-learnings, online, live trainings, and so on, most of them. The question that comes often from users is when to use what. So I'm figuring now that we have already many resources for knowledge, like websites, internal websites, but also, of course, people can Google the tools that we use. So they can use search somewhere online, anywhere. Also, we have those trainings we give, and some of the tools that we provide have FAQs and bots already included. My organization, by the way, already started using bots, but other teams are so very excited and still working on doing it, but that's other story. So I'm wondering how to use bots in a way that it's clear for users when they should actually reach for it. I don't want to multiply many resources in every place just to having too many resources. I'm wondering, will people know when it's the best for them to use it, or should we how to position bots?
As I mentioned earlier, my hearing is not great right now, and I only heard bits and pieces of that question. So I think the question was around how to stop repetition across various places, and also when to encourage someone to use it over something else. And
how to position bots, exactly.
Yeah. So I think the first point, from a more technical perspective, actually the speaker from Adobe touched on this. If you have existing content that has good metadata attached to it, it's fairly easy to use it in a variety of contexts, multiple contexts, and not duplicate the content. So again, if your body of information is well formatted, you can use it in new tools quite easily. The second question, I guess, is a harder one to answer without too much detail about what you do. But I guess it would be, for the time being, it's probably when you detect people are having a problem finding something. I don't know, maybe they have looked for 3 things using a traditional search and they still haven't really read anything yet. So they're obviously struggling to find something, and you could pop up one of those irritating boxes saying, can I help you, for example. In the long run, I think these sorts of assistants, and I would like to use the word assistant because I think that's what they will be more like. People will get more used to using them. over time anyway, and maybe the demand will be there, or it's just more expected that it's an option too. So I'm not sure if those answers helped, because I didn't really hear everything you said. So maybe you come and speak to me later where I actually hear you more clearly, and if that was completely the wrong answers, the wrong questions, then we could talk.
No, it mostly covered. I will catch you later also. Thanks.
Okay, I think we're...
Yeah, we need to finish now.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
We can
so
have a
much for your
conversation later.
presentation. Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Thank you.